At the very bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, about 3,300 feet beneath the surface, there is a lake inside the ocean. A perfect oval of dark, dense water, about 100 feet across, that glistens strangely under submersible lights. Around its rim, dead crabs lie scattered, their pale shells half sunk in brine. Some died just after falling in. Others got close enough to the edge of the fumes to kill them. This isn't science fiction, it's a real place, known to oceanographers as the Jacuzzi of Despair. It's one of the most hostile environments on the planet, so salty and toxic with hydrogen sulfide and methane that it can burn and suffocate anything that enters. It looks like a shimmering oasis at the bottom of the sea, but enter it, even brush against it, and it kills you almost instantly. The thing is, it doesn't look deadly, it looks beautiful, it looks inviting, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Over the past century, the United States has developed a strange habit of declaring wars on things that can't actually surrender. We have fought wars on ideas, on feelings, on nouns. In the 1960s, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on poverty. Poverty won. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan launched a war on drugs. Today, overdose deaths are higher than ever. We have declared a war on crime, a war on cancer, and a war on obesity. All noble intentions, yet impossible to actually win. And America ought to know better, as Enlightenment philosopher Thomas Paine wrote that there is no way that England could defeat an idea with an army. Of course, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. In 2001, the US launched the War on Terror, the most ambitious and open-ended declaration of them all. Sparked by the trauma of 9/11, it would become the longest military conflict in American history, stretching across continents and decades. A war with no formal declaration, no clear enemy, and no visible finish line. Like the Jacuzzi of Despair, it felt like we were doing something, that we had found the source of our pain and could destroy it. But in reality, we are sinking deeper into something we couldn't control, a war that would reshape our laws, our politics, our foreign policy, and our place in the world. One of the central myths of the War on Terror is that Osama Bin Laden wanted the United States to invade, that the entire attack was a carefully designed trap meant to lure America into a quagmire, overextend its military, and radicalize the Muslim world. But that's not what Bin Laden actually believed on the morning of September 11th. According to journalist and historian Peter Bergen, who interviewed Bin Laden in the 1990s and has studied al-Qaeda for decades, Bin Laden badly misjudged how the United States would respond. The journalist describes him as delusional, saying he had no idea the United States was really going to go into Afghanistan and topple the Taliban. Instead, Bin Laden believed America would retreat, just as it had withdrawn from Lebanon in the 1980s and Somalia in the 1990s, and that US-backed regimes like the Saudi royal family would eventually collapse without American support. None of that happened. Instead of driving the United States out of the Middle East, 9/11 pulled America in deeper. The Taliban government fell. Al-Qaeda's infrastructure was shattered. Of the roughly 1,900 Arab fighters living in Afghanistan at the time, more than 1,600 were killed or captured within months. And yet Bin Laden could never let go of the myth of his own genius. In the years that followed, while hiding from American drones and increasingly disconnected from his former command structure, he began rewriting his own intentions. He framed the invasion of Afghanistan as part of a grand strategy all along. Bergen later described this as an ex post facto gloss, a convenient retelling of a plan that never really existed. By the end of his life, Bin Laden had been reduced to issuing unrealistic orders to a hollowed-out network. He instructed followers to assassinate President Obama while sparing Vice President Biden, believing Biden would be incapable of leading the country effectively. At the time, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper compared bin Laden's thinking to Adolf Hitler at the end of World War II, moving imaginary divisions around a map that no longer reflected reality. But back in 2001, no one saw bin Laden as delusional. On the morning of September 12th, he was the embodiment of terror, the man who had humiliated the world's only superpower and seemingly escaped without consequence. U.S. officials rushed to pull every file they had on Al-Qaeda. The paper tiger wasn't paper after all. It had simply been sleeping. In today's episode, we begin where the towers fell. We follow America's first steps into Afghanistan, the failure to capture bin Laden at Tora Bora, and the evolution of the war on terror into something far larger and far harder to win. This is the story of how a nation responded to trauma, how patriotism became policy, and how the pursuit of one terrorist leader drew the United States into a conflict much bigger than the man himself. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the terrorist Osama Bin Laden. Episode number 6, The War on Terror. Within minutes of the attacks on September 11th, CIA Director George Tenet informed President George W. Bush that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were responsible. After identifying the 19 hijackers, the FBI carefully mapped out the connections between them and the leader of Al-Qaeda. 9 days later, President Bush delivered the government's findings during a joint address to Congress. Answering the question of who attacked our country, the president declared that the evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al-Qaeda. They are the same murderers indicted for bombing American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, and responsible for bombing the USS Cole. The president then shifted towards framing bin Laden and his followers as an ideological enemy, embedding the concept of radical Islam into the American consciousness. In the president's words, Al-Qaeda is to terror what the mafia is to crime. But its goal is not making money. Its goal is remaking the world and imposing its radical beliefs on people everywhere. The terrorists practice a fringe form of Islamic extremism that has been rejected by Muslim scholars and the vast majority of Muslim clerics, a fringe movement that perverts the peaceful teachings of Islam. The group and its leader, a person named Osama bin Laden, are linked to many other organizations in different countries, including the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. They are recruited from their own nations and neighborhoods and brought to camps in places like Afghanistan, where they are trained in the tactics of terror. They are then sent back to their homes or sent to hide in countries around the world to plot evil and destruction. This portrayal of bin Laden as only one figure among dozens of terrorist leaders, combined with the warning that more than 60 countries harbored men like him, was designed to terrify a nation still reeling less than 2 weeks after the attacks. The congressional resolution authorizing the war in Afghanistan reflected the vast scope of the threat described by the president, effectively laying the foundation for a global war on terror. Still, Bush placed particular focus on Afghanistan. He demanded that the Taliban hand over all al-Qaeda leaders hiding within its borders, release foreign nationals unjustly imprisoned since the Taliban takeover, protect foreign aid workers, close every terrorist training camp, and grant the United States full access to verify that those camps were no longer operational. After preparing Americans for what he believed to be a long and difficult conflict, the president called on nations around the world to join the fight. A fight, he said, for all people who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom. The war moved quickly. The United States provided overwhelming air support, targeted Taliban logistics, and linked special forces units with anti-Taliban fighters from the Northern Alliance. On October 7, 2001, the first sustained bombing campaign began, and by early November, coalition forces were advancing almost without resistance. First came the fall of Mazar-i-Sharif, then Kabul, and Herat. When Kandahar was captured on December 9, 2001, the ruling Taliban government was widely considered overthrown. In early December, intelligence analysts placed Osama Bin Laden inside the Tora Bora cave complex. Over the following 2 weeks, U.S. Special Forces, CIA paramilitary operatives, and Northern Alliance fighters sealed ridge lines above the cave network while coordinating closely with American air controllers embedded on the ground. At its height, coalition aircraft carried out roughly 100 strikes a day, making Tora Bora one of the heaviest bombing campaigns of the war. The terrain was brutal, rugged, cave-riddled mountains rising above 8,000 feet, cut through by deep ravines that Bin Laden knew intimately after helping build access roads there during the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s. It was here that one critical strategic decision changed everything. U.S. commanders refused requests to deploy at least 1,000 elite ground troops, including Army Rangers and Marines, to seal the mountain escape routes. Instead, they relied on Afghan militias and Pakistani forces to intercept fleeing fighters. Despite those groups often lacking the training, equipment, night vision capability, and motivation needed to stop al-Qaeda escapees. Later, analysts at the Brookings Institution summarized the decision bluntly, writing, "The decision to rely on Afghan militias and not send U.S. infantry to close escape exits allowed bin Laden to slip away." CIA commanders on the ground, including Gary Bernstein, urgently requested reinforcements. Bernstein reportedly told superiors, "Let's kill this baby in the crib." Those requests were denied. Despite the relentless bombing and localized battlefield gains, with an estimated 220 to 500 al-Qaeda fighters killed and roughly 52 captured, bin Laden himself escaped into Pakistan sometime around December 16th. His survival was confirmed more than a week later, when footage of the aging but still living terrorist leader surfaced on December 27th. The world would not know bin Laden's exact location again until May 2, 2011, when SEAL Team 6 sent back photographs confirming his death. For 3,424 days, the world's most infamous terrorists evaded the most sophisticated surveillance system ever created. That system included the military-industrial complex, sweeping new surveillance programs, both legal and illegal, created through the rushed passage of the USA Patriot Act, and testimony extracted from hundreds of illegally rendered prisons held at secret sites around the world. By December, Kandahar had fallen, the Taliban government had collapsed, and bin Laden had slipped through the mountains of Tora Bora. Still, America was not leaving Afghanistan. Soon, the war changed from one centered on capturing territory to one focused on capturing people. Washington had become obsessed with preventing another 9/11. Who knew what? Where was bin Laden hiding? What attacks were still being planned? In pursuit of those answers, the United States began detaining virtually anyone who might know something, or who was suspected of knowing something. If you happened to be near a battlefield, a safe house, a mosque, or simply near the wrong person's suspicions, you could disappear. The CIA called it extraordinary rendition, a bureaucratic phrase for kidnapping. In the years after 9/11, public reporting and flight records identified at least 307 suspected rendition flights involving 69 countries. Credible estimates place the number of foreign nationals rendered during the early years of the War on Terror at roughly 150 people. The full scope remains difficult to determine because the entire program operated in near total secrecy. If not for the reporting of Dana Priest and the Washington Post, the program might never have become public at all. Years later, Politico took a deeper look at President Bush's decisions in the aftermath of 9/11. With the benefit of hindsight, the publication argued that many of his most consequential actions, including the invasion of Iraq, stemmed from mistaking a singular, if horribly tragic event for an existential threat. In Politico's framing, Bush treated a non-state actor that was in fact fairly small and weak as though it were a massive state-sponsored menace. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. once argued that great presidents, men like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, became great because they successfully navigated genuine turning points in history. By contrast, weak presidents like James Buchanan failed when history demanded leadership. But Politico posed a different question. What happens when a president wrongly believes he is living through a civilization-defining moment? What happens when a terrible but isolated tragedy is transformed into a permanent state of emergency? Retired Marine General Anthony Zinni argued exactly that. September 11th was not an existential threat, he said. It was a band of maybe 1,000 radicals. Yet we created an investment in this on the level of what we do for existential threats. Obviously, we were traumatized by 9/11. I don't mean to downplay that. But this was not communism nor fascism. And yet the Patriot Act pressured public librarians to turn over checkout records in the search for hidden terrorist cells that in many cases never existed. The American social contract traces back to the philosopher John Locke, who argued that people surrender part of their liberty in exchange for protection and stability from the state. But that balance is always fragile. In moments of fear and crisis, governments often push to expand their power, offering greater security in exchange for reduced freedom. And over time, those concessions become normalized. We remove our shoes at airports. We carry our belongings in clear bags at sporting events. And many learned to look away while prisoners were tortured in former Soviet gulags and secret detention sites scattered across the globe. We still ignore the fact that there are prisoners in Cuba at Guantanamo Bay. The War on Terror provided yet another reminder that torture rarely produces reliable intelligence. In many cases, the information extracted through waterboarding, electric shocks, and sleep deprivation proved not just useless, but actively counterproductive. Historian Shane O'Mara noted that there is ample evidence that the extreme stress caused by torture leads to structural neurological changes, particularly in regions responsible for regulating anxiety, memory, fear, and emotional response. As a result, torture often damages a victim's ability to accurately recall the very information interrogators are seeking. And this was hardly a new discovery. The Spanish Inquisition had already reached similar conclusions centuries earlier. History is filled with examples of torture producing false confessions. During the European witch trials, countless accused witches confessed to meeting the devil under threat of torture. Likewise, Jewish communities targeted by the anti-Semitic blood libel conspiracy often produce false confessions after unbearable abuse and coercion. In both cases, the torturers pointed to those confessions as proof that their methods worked, and then used that evidence to justify persecuting even more innocent people. Even the CIA's own internal reviews later concluded that traditional FBI interrogation methods, calm, patient, and methodical, consistently produced better intelligence than coercive tactics. But by then, the momentum of the War on Terror was carrying the United States towards something much larger, the global securitization of politics itself, with liberty increasingly sacrificed in the name of safety. On the evening of January 29, 2002, President Bush delivered his State of the Union address to Congress. Alongside updates on the war in Afghanistan, he dramatically widened the scope of the conflict by introducing what he called the axis of evil. Nations accused of sponsoring terrorism while seeking weapons of mass destruction. Among them were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. The shift was unmistakable. The war on terror was no longer just about hunting Osama bin Laden. In a history classroom, the sequence of events feels fast. 9/11 happens. America invades Afghanistan, then America invades Iraq. But living through it did not feel fast at all. The invasion of Iraq did not begin until March of 2003, a year and a half after the Twin Towers fell. And the reason it took that long is because selling the war was difficult, even for a president riding a 90% approval rating. Because no matter how angry Americans were after 9/11, many still wanted proof. Proof that Saddam Hussein had something to do with it. He didn't. And to be fair, President George W. Bush never directly claimed that Saddam Hussein orchestrated the attacks of September 11th, but he implied a connection repeatedly. Syracuse University publishes an academic journal titled Expressions. In a 2005 article, the publication explained that President Bush never publicly blamed Saddam Hussein or Iraq for the events of September 11th, but by consistently linking Iraq with terrorism and Al-Qaeda, he provided the context from which such a connection could be made. Bush also never publicly connected Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, whether or not Bush connected each dot from Saddam Hussein to bin Laden, the way language and transitions are shaped in his official speeches almost compelled listeners to infer a connection. That rhetorical strategy mattered. Bush often moved seamlessly from discussing 9/11 to discussing Saddam Hussein, blending two separate threats together in the minds of millions of Americans. By 2003, a Gallup poll found that roughly 7 in 10 Americans believed Saddam Hussein had personally been involved in the September 11th attacks. And this linguistic sleight of hand brings us to what may be the dumbest tangent in this entire series. France was one of several major powers pushing back against the coming invasion of Iraq. But by that point, the Bush administration and much of the Republican Party had fully committed themselves to war. The train had already left the station. 9 days before the invasion began, members of Congress started renaming anything associated with France as freedom instead. French fries became freedom fries. French toast was sold as freedom toast. This was hardly the first time Americans had resorted to wartime rebranding. During World War I, anti-German sentiment briefly transformed the hamburger into a Liberty sandwich, while the Frankfurter evolved into a Liberty sausage before eventually becoming the all-American hot dog. Even earlier, in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, Americans promoted Liberty tea as a patriotic alternative to British imports. Adding to the absurdity, neither French fries nor French toast actually originated in France. French fries trace their origins to poor villages in Belgium, where farmers traditionally cut potatoes into the shape of small fish during winter months when rivers froze over and fishing became impossible. During World War I, many Belgian soldiers spoke French, leading American troops to mistakenly assume the fries they shared with were French. Meanwhile, French toast dates all the way back to ancient Rome in the 4th century. In France itself, the dish is called pain perdu, literally lost bread. It was created as a way to revive stale bread that would otherwise have been thrown away. It's a ridiculous tangent, but it was also the sort of thing that Congress was focused on in the lead-up to war. While Saddam Hussein likely celebrated any attack against the United States, he and Osama bin Laden were never natural allies. In fact, bin Laden openly condemned Saddam's secular Ba'athist regime. Saudi Arabia had even placed pressure on bin Laden years earlier because his rhetoric and militancy threatened to destabilize the region and provoke wider conflict, because he was arguing against Saddam Hussein. The two men may have hated America, but ideologically they were worlds apart. Lock Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden in the same room and only one of them is walking back out. So if Saddam Hussein didn't carry out 9/11, why did America invade Iraq? There are countless theories, some strategic, others cynical, a few deeply personal. One of the most persistent explanations was revenge. After the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein allegedly orchestrated a plot to assassinate former President George W. Bush during a visit to Kuwait in 1993. Kuwaiti intelligence uncovered a car bomb operation tied to Iraqi agents before the attack could take place. Years later, in his memoirs, George W. Bush wrote that he admired his father's restraint after the Gulf War, but also believed that taking Saddam out was the right decision. But perhaps the most fascinating answer to the question of why America invaded Iraq involves something else entirely: God. According to several reports, Bush told a group of Palestinian officials that he believed he had been chosen by God to lead, and that God had instructed him to end the tyranny in Iraq. This was not merely political rhetoric. The Bush presidency leaned heavily into religious framing after 9/11. The war on terror became more than a campaign for national security. It became a moral struggle between good and evil. Bush frequently quoted scripture and once referred to the fight against terrorism as a crusade, a term his staff quickly tried to walk back, but one that lingered in public memory. In 2009, documents published by GQ revealed that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld routinely included Bible verses in presidential war briefings. Images of American tanks and troops were paired with scripture passages such as, "Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter. And whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" These were not ordinary policy memos. They were designed to read like battle hymns. Whether Bush genuinely believed God had called him to war, or whether the religious framing served primarily as political theater, almost becomes besides the point. The effect was the same. By presenting the invasion of Iraq as a moral mission of liberation and justice, the administration gave the war a weight that extended far beyond traditional geopolitical strategy. And that made dissent more difficult, because questioning the war could easily be framed as questioning patriotism, morality, or even divine purpose itself. So when critics raised concerns about the intelligence, the timing, or the actual purpose of a second invasion of Iraq, the answers were not always rooted in evidence. Many times they were rooted in faith. But while faith may move mountains, it cannot manufacture weapons of mass destruction out of thin air. The Bush administration ultimately built its case for war on three major arguments. First, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. Second, Saddam's government supported international terrorism. And third, Iraq had secretly restarted its weapons of mass destruction program. Secretary of State Colin Powell was tasked with presenting the case before the United Nations. Powell, one of the most respected military leaders from the First Gulf War, arrived armed with what the administration described as its strongest evidence. But much of that evidence had been selectively assembled to support a conclusion already reached. As CIA analyst Paul Pillar later put it, the intelligence process was used not to inform decision-making, but to justify a decision already made. So let's examine those claims one at a time. First, Saddam Hussein was a terrible human being. That one checks out. As covered extensively in our Season 2 series on Saddam Hussein, his regime used chemical weapons against civilians, devastated the marshlands associated with the ancient cradle of civilization, and cultivated a culture of extreme violence and sadism. Saddam and his son Uday became infamous for brutalizing even Iraq's own athletes, including stories of torture and abuse directed at underperforming soccer players. There is no serious debate that Saddam Hussein presided over a horrific dictatorship. But it is worth remembering that the United States has historically supported leaders who committed similar atrocities when doing so aligned with American strategic interests. From Pinochet in Chile to the Shah of Iran to Saddam Hussein himself during the Iran-Iraq War, morality has often taken a backseat to geopolitical utility. The second argument centered on terrorism. On the surface, that claim was also true. Saddam Hussein did support certain terrorist organizations, particularly Palestinian militant groups. He provided financial support to the families of suicide bombers and maintained connections with regional militant networks. But after 9/11, Americans heard the word terrorism and immediately pictured the collapsing towers of the World Trade Center. Powell made this assertion in a speech to the United Nations, proclaiming that Iraq and terrorism go back decades. Baghdad trains Palestine Liberation Front members in small arms and explosives. Saddam uses the Arab Liberation Front to funnel money to the families of Palestinian suicide bombers in order to prolong the Intifada. And it's no secret that Saddam's own intelligence services was involved in dozens of attacks or attempted assassinations in the 1990s. But then the former general turned statesman went a step too far, telling the assembled audience that what I want to bring your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the Al-Qaeda network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. He then proceeded to point out that al-Zakari, a known Al-Qaeda operative, had set up a new camp in Iraq. While the future founder of ISIS may have been physically in Iraq, the United Nations investigation found no connection between the terrorist and the Iraqi regime. But the argument that overshadowed all of the public discourse was Powell's claim that Saddam Hussein had managed to secretly continue his weapons of mass destruction program via mobile weapons labs. Accordingly, the U.S. was alleging that Saddam had successfully evaded the international testing regime that had been put in place in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War. Virtually everything about that argument turned out to be false. Nowhere was that more evident than in one of the administration's most dramatic claims, that Saddam Hussein had attempted to purchase yellow cake uranium from Niger, a vital component for producing nuclear weapons. The evidence behind that claim came from a single informant, a man known in intelligence circles as Curveball. Curveball was an Iraqi defector who claimed to have knowledge of mobile biological weapons labs and clandestine uranium purchases. The CIA, desperate for insight into Saddam's inner workings, seized on his accounts, even though Curveball had never actually worked in the weapons program, and even though German intelligence, who handled him directly, warned U.S. officials that he was unreliable. Those warnings were ignored. Curveball had a history of concocting stories to gain asylum and financial support. Intelligence officials had every reason to question his credibility. But in the pressure cooker environment of post-9/11 Washington, skepticism was replaced by urgency. And that urgency blurred the line between cautious analysis and willful belief. Instead of corroborating the claim through independent sources, a standard practice in intelligence work, the administration elevated Curveball's fabrications to the national stage. President Bush even included the yellow cake claim in his 2003 State of the Union address, stating, "The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa." The phrase, "the British government has learned," was a deliberate choice. It allowed Bush to distance the claim from American intelligence, even though the CIA had already tried to strike the line from earlier drafts of the speech, citing lack of evidence. And it wasn't just the yellow cake. The story about mobile biological weapons labs came straight from Curveball as well. And again, it was taken at face value, despite red flags and denials from experts within the Defense Intelligence Agency and State Department. The problem wasn't just bad intelligence. The problem was a determination to go to war and the manipulation of information to justify it. As intelligence expert Paul Pillar, who served as the National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia at the time, would later write, the Bush administration deviated from the professional standards of intelligence analysis in order to support a policy agenda. Intelligence was used not to inform policy, but to justify it after fact. This was not a process of discovery. It was a process of reverse engineering, starting with a conclusion and working backwards to find anything that could make it sound true. In Curveball, they found the perfect partner, as he would later explain that, I had the chance to fabricate something to topple the regime. I and my sons are proud of that, and we are proud that we were the reason to give Iraq the margin of democracy. In the end, the weapons of mass destruction weren't there. There were no mobile labs, no uranium deals, no connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. But by the time that became clear, the war had already begun. If you're looking for a full retelling of Saddam Hussein's final chapter, his unraveling regime, his capture in a spider hole, and his eventual execution, be sure to check out our Season 2 series, where we dive deep into the brutal regime and bloody fall of Iraq's strongmen. But for now, let's summarize the major beats of a war that reshaped not only Iraq, but America's place in the world. On March 20th, 2003, the United States launched its invasion of Iraq under the Pentagon's banner of Operation Shock and Awe. The strategy relied on speed, precision, and overwhelming force. In the first 24 hours alone, coalition forces carried out more than 1,700 air sorties while launching over 500 cruise missiles at Baghdad in an attempt to decapitate Saddam Hussein's leadership and shatter Iraqi resistance before it could fully organize. On CNN, live coverage showed blinding flashes tearing across the Baghdad skyline, transforming the city into a spectacle of modern warfare broadcast in real time to millions around the world. The strikes were devastatingly effective, but they also destroyed critical infrastructure, electrical grids, communication centers, roads, bridges, and government buildings. Many of the same structures the United States would soon spend years trying to rebuild. And rebuilding Iraq became a business opportunity. Companies like Halliburton, the former employer of Vice President Dick Cheney, received billions of dollars in no-bid reconstruction contracts. Supporters argued the company had the expertise necessary for massive logistical operations. Critics saw something darker, a war increasingly intertwined with private profit. As American soldiers continued dying and Iraq's streets slipped further into chaos, those corporate connections deepened public skepticism about the war itself. Back in Washington, however, the tone remained triumphant. Just 6 weeks after the invasion began, on May 1, 2003, President George W. Bush arrived aboard the Lockheed S-3 Viking on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. Dressed in a flight suit and stepping from the cockpit like a wartime aviator, Bush delivered a nationally televised speech beneath a massive banner reading, "Mission accomplished." In that speech, Bush declared that major combat operations in Iraq have ended. And in that moment, many Americans believed him. But the reality was very different. The war was just beginning. Saddam Hussein's conventional army had collapsed quickly, but a far deadlier insurgency was taking shape in its place, one that would evolve into years of sectarian violence, roadside bombings, urban warfare, and eventually open civil conflict. Iraq itself was unraveling. American objectives grew increasingly unclear, while the enemy became harder to define with each passing month. And as Iraq descended into instability, another realization slowly emerged. The war in Afghanistan was slipping away. By committing so heavily to Iraq, the United States had diverted enormous financial, military, and political resources away from the first war it launched after 9/11, a war it was still far from winning. Despite spending more on defense than the next several nations combined, the United States appeared poorly prepared for the kind of conflict it had entered. This was no longer conventional warfare. It was nation building, counterinsurgency, intelligence gathering, occupation, tribal politics, urban insurgency, endless pursuits of enemies who could disappear across borders, mountains, and deserts faster than the world's most advanced military could track them. 2 wars, 2 missions, 1 increasingly exhausted superpower. While American boots hit the ground in Iraq and the war dominated headlines, it's worth stepping back to ask, what about Osama Bin Laden? After slipping out of Tora Bora in late December 2001 through a network of loyal tribesmen and along the mountainous, porous border of Pakistan, Bin Laden didn't vanish. But he didn't broadcast his location either. We now know, based on documents found after the 2011 raid on his Abbottabad compound, that Bin Laden spent much of this period on the move, shuttling between safe houses in Pakistan's tribal regions, especially Waziristan, and relying on an elaborate courier network to avoid detection. He grew a thick beard, altered his appearance, and even instructed his followers not to use technology that could be tracked. No phones, no internet. He was living in the shadows, but still trying to steer the movement he had ignited. And despite the constant pressure from US intelligence and Pakistani security forces, Bin Laden remained highly active ideologically, even if not operationally. In November 2002, more than a year after 9/11, Bin Laden released an audio tape, his first in months, warning Arab nations not to support the United States in its military efforts. The message named names: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, and Jordan, accusing them of betraying Islam by siding with the infidel occupiers. A month later, in February 2003, just weeks before the US invasion of Iraq, another tape emerged. This one is more controversial. In it, Bin Laden appeared to express solidarity with Iraqi Muslims and called for resistance to any US invasion. This tape did not suggest an alliance with Saddam Hussein. In fact, Bin Laden had called the Iraqi dictator an apostate in the past. But the message was cynically misinterpreted by some in the Bush administration as proof of collaboration between al-Qaeda and the Iraqi regime. What Bin Laden was actually doing was positioning himself as the voice of Islamic resistance, trying to hijack the narrative and paint the US invasion as a new crusade against Muslims. It was opportunistic messaging. He knew that another American-led war in the Middle East would create chaos, and chaos he believed would birth more jihadists. From what we now understand through interrogations, seized laptops, and private letters, Bin Laden had mixed feelings during this period. He was frustrated at al-Qaeda's inability to launch another large-scale attack, but elated that the United States seemed to be walking into every trap he had hoped they would, sowing resentment, radicalizing civilians, and opening up new battlefields. In one letter recovered from his compound, Bin Laden advised his followers not to form alliances with groups like Iran or Saddam's Ba'athis, emphasizing ideological purity. At the same time, he saw the American focus on Iraq as a strategic gift, a diversion that gave him breathing room. In a tragic twist, while the world was fixated on Baghdad, Bin Laden was quietly regrouping, wounded, isolated, but far from defeated. As 2003 rolled on, it became clear that America had taken on more than it could handle. The Taliban had fallen quickly in Afghanistan, and Saddam Hussein's regime had collapsed with equal speed in Iraq. But removing governments is not the same as rebuilding nations, and winning battles is not the same as winning peace. While Iraq spiraled into chaos, sectarian violence, looting, an emerging insurgency, the war in Afghanistan, once seen as the good war, began to deteriorate. U.S. forces, already stretched thin, had redeployed troops and resources to the new war in Iraq. The Taliban, once scattered, began to regroup across the border in Pakistan, finding sanctuary in tribal areas like Qaeda. With less pressure and more time, they built back their networks, recruited new fighters, and launched a sustained insurgency campaign. Why did Afghanistan unravel? Because the United States misunderstood its enemy. It saw the Taliban as a centralized regime that could be decapitated. In reality, they were a decentralized movement, deeply embedded in local culture, tribal politics, and religious identity. The U.S. won the opening round with airstrikes and alliances, but never had a real plan for winning hearts and minds, let alone governing a fractured nation with centuries of resistance to outsiders. Afghanistan wasn't just a war of guns, it was a war of ideas, and America brought very few to the table. To compensate for the lack of ground troops and growing domestic exhaustion with boots on the ground, Washington turned to a new tool: the drone. The MQ-1 Predator, equipped with cameras and Hellfire missiles, became the symbol of the next phase of the war on terror. Drones allowed the U.S. to strike targets without risking American lives. No body bags, no CNN coverage of fallen soldiers, just pinprick strikes from the sky. But while drones were tactically effective, they were strategically dangerous. Yes, they eliminated high-value targets, but they also killed civilians, men, women, and children who became known as collateral damage, sometimes entire families based on faulty intelligence or pattern-of-life analysis. In rural Pakistan, Yemen, and Afghanistan, drone strikes were often met with mourning, anger, and calls for revenge. The Center for Strategic and International Studies revealed that drone strikes radicalize civilians faster than they kill terrorists, as the surgical precision advertised by Pentagon spokespeople was frequently anything but. And then came Abu Ghraib. In 2004, shocking images emerged from the Iraqi prison just west of Baghdad. Hooded men on leashes, naked detainees stacked like cordwood, grinning American soldiers posing next to them like tourists in a haunted house. The abuse of prisoners wasn't just immoral, it was a strategic catastrophe. The photos were broadcast around the world, used as recruitment propaganda by terrorist organizations, cited in speeches by radicals, and carved into the memory of a generation. Bin Laden may have been in hiding, but America was giving al-Qaeda everything it needed, not in weapons, but in narrative. We were the invaders, the torturers, the occupiers who claimed moral superiority while violating our own principles. As one former CIA officer later put it, Abu Ghraib was worth 1,000 recruiting videos. Meanwhile, the two wars dragged on. Budgets ballooned, American casualties rose, the coalition of the willing became increasingly unwilling. Afghanistan, once considered the easy war, became a forever war. Iraq, sold as a quick mission, became a quagmire. We were sitting in the jacuzzi of despair. And across the globe, the war on terror transformed from a military campaign into something much darker: a global system of surveillance, rendition, targeted killing, and moral erosion. And Osama bin Laden? He watched it all unfold from a safe house in Pakistan as his enemy stumbled into exactly the kind of overreach he had once only dreamed of. By the time President George W. Bush left office in January 2009, the war on terror had outlasted both the momentum that launched it and the presidency that gave it its name. The war in Afghanistan had entered its 8th year. American forces were still hunting Osama bin Laden, still building schools and prisons in Iraq, and still attempting to create democratic governments in nations historically ruled through force, tribal structures, or family dynasties. At home, the mood had shifted. The public was growing exhausted. The economy was collapsing, and the war, once framed as a unifying national mission, had become a grinding, permanent feature of American life. One of the most enduring legacies of the Bush era was Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp, the U.S. military prison established in Cuba in early 2002 as a legal gray zone for detaining so-called enemy combatants. Over time, Guantanamo became a symbol of America's post-9/11 moral compromise. At its peak, the prison held nearly 780 detainees. Some had been captured on legitimate battlefields. Others, however, were handed over by rival warlords, tribal enemies, or bounty hunters seeking American cash rewards. A classified CIA cable from 2002 later suggested that at least 1/3 of the detainees had no meaningful ties to terrorism at all. And then came the Quran controversy. In May 2005, Newsweek published allegations that U.S. interrogators at Guantanamo had desecrated copies of the Quran, flushing them down toilets, stepping on them, or using them during interrogations as psychological intimidation. Whether every detail of the report was accurate quickly becomes besides the point. The reaction across the Muslim world was immediate. In Afghanistan alone, riots left at least 15 people dead and more than 100 injured. Protests spread through Pakistan, Indonesia, and the Palestinian territories. The United States, still claiming to fight for liberty and democracy, was increasingly viewed by many abroad as both an occupying power and a force hostile to Islam itself. Into that political and cultural firestorm stepped Barack Obama, a first-time senator from Illinois who had risen to national prominence in part because of his early opposition to the Iraq War. When Obama took office in January 2009, he inherited 2 wars, a collapsing economy, and a deeply fractured national security apparatus. But he also inherited enormous political capital. During the campaign, Obama had called Iraq the wrong war, and promised to refocus American attention on what he described as the right war, Afghanistan, the country where the September 11th attacks had originated and where bin Laden had once hidden in plain sight. So in December 2009, Obama ordered a surge of 30,000 additional troops into Afghanistan, temporarily pushing the American presence above 100,000 soldiers. The objective was straightforward: blunt the Taliban's momentum, stabilize the Afghan government, and begin a responsible withdrawal by July 2011. It was a calculated gamble. But like the troops' surge in Iraq before it, many critics argued it came too late. The Afghan government under Hamid Karzai was deeply corrupt. Taliban fighters continued operating from safe havens inside Pakistan, and despite outspending the next several nations combined on defense, the United States struggled to maintain control over isolated rural regions where goats often outnumbered people. So the Obama administration increasingly shifted towards a different strategy: technology. The CIA drone program, first expanded under Bush, became a centerpiece of Obama's counterterrorism policy. In 2008, the United States carried out 33 drone strikes inside Pakistan. By 2010, that number had risen to more than 120. The strikes successfully killed high-profile militant figures, including Batwad Massoud, Anwar al-Awlaki, and Hassan Ghul. But civilians died alongside them. A report by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimated that American drone strikes killed between 384 and 807 civilians in Pakistan between 2004 and 2014 alone. Then, in September 2011, Osama authorized one of the most controversial decisions in the entire war on terror: the the targeted killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen and radical cleric living in Yemen. Awlaki had inspired extremist attacks in the West and was accused of helping coordinate terrorist plots, including the failed 2009 underwear bomber attack. But he had never been formally charged in court. There was no extradition process, no trial, no public presentation of evidence. Instead, an American drone strike killed him, along with another U.S. citizen, Samir Khan, in Yemen. Civil liberties advocates were alarmed. The New York Times described it as the first targeted killing of an American since the Civil War. The Obama administration defended the strike as lawful under the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, the same brief congressional resolution that had originally authorized military action in Afghanistan a decade earlier. By this point, the war on terror had fundamentally changed. What began with soldiers and invasions was increasingly being fought through surveillance networks, algorithms, kill lists, and drone operators watching targets from computer screens thousands of miles away in Nevada. And still, the United States was losing the broader war of ideas. Guantanamo remained open. Drone strikes often created as much resentment as they eliminated militants, and the scandals involving torture and prisoner abuse continued to reverberate throughout the Middle East and beyond. Meanwhile, terrorist organizations were evolving rather than disappearing. Americans learned about new organizations bearing new names. There was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and Al-Shabaab, all of which were expanding or re-emerging. And Osama Bin Laden, the face of the entire conflict, was still alive. But behind the scenes, the intelligence net was tightening. Surveillance was narrowed onto a mysterious compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a compound that was drawing more attention with every passing month. In the next episode, we leave the battlefield and move into the shadows, tracing the final years of Osama bin Laden's life. How he hid, how he communicated, and how one of the most secretive operations in modern American history finally brought his story to an end in 2011. This is the beginning of that end. While it is a difficult subject, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.